Hello everyone and welcome to Game 8 from the Women's World Championship. It is Wenjun versus Tingjie, and you know what happened. First 4 games ended in a draw, then in Game 5, Tingjie defeated Wenjun, taking the lead in the match. Then we had Game 6 and Game 7, which also ended in a draw, and this is now Game 8, which is, a very lovely game. But the match is no longer played in Shanghai. We already said that the first 6 games will be played in Shanghai, which is Wenjun's home city, and Lei Tingjie is from Chongqing, so the other 6 games are being played in Chongqing. So if you guys are interested in the city, this is Chongqing, where the last 6 games of the match will be played, unless we will have tie breaks. Some history behind it: it was the area was conquered in 316 BC, so over 2,000 years old, really, and the city was not open to foreigners up until 1891. So, like really, for 2 millennia, they did not allow anyone to come in. And then in 1997, the government merged Chongqing with several surrounding districts, making it a very, very large municipality. If you're wondering how large it is, it's some 29 million people. So just to have some background on where the match is being played. So that being said, let's check it out. Wenjun has the white pieces, and she opens with with knight to f3. She goes for the Reti opening. We have pawn to d5, we have e3, and pawn to c5, grabbing the full center here, which is not uncommon. When you play the Reti, you want to control the center with the pieces, and of course, black will try to take advantage of this by taking control of the center with the pawn. So pawn to b3, knight to c6, and now bishop to b2. We have pawn to a6 and pawn to g3, queen to c7, and there is a game that reached this exact same position, Zoltan Almasi versus Ina Gaponenko. It was played in 2017 in the Isle of Man tournament, where pawn to c4 was played, but here we have pawn to d4, and it is now already, as of move 6, that we have a completely new game, which is absolutely incredible for a World Chess Championship match game. So okay, c captures on d4, we have e captures and bishop to g4. Now makes sense, you want to develop pinning the knight, so bishop to g2, also adding another defender. e6, this is a beautiful setup now for Lei, as she put her pawns on light squares. The bishop is already out of the cage, so you don't have to worry about that, and the dark square bishop is free to roam in between the dark squares that are available to him. So castles, we have knight to f6, and now knight b to d2. We have bishop to d6. Again, both players just putting pieces on optimal squares, and pawn to c4. We have castles and pawn to a3 now. We have pawn to a5, stopping b4, and pawn to h3, challenging the bishop here. So, of course, you don't want to give up your bishop pair to quickly bishop h5 and queen to e2, developing the queen and connecting rooks. We have rook f to d8, and now rook 8 to c1, nicely aligning the rook with the queen on c7. D captures on c4, b captures, and now bishop to e7. So the rook nicely controls the d file. We have queen to e3, moving out of this bishop's diagonal. So now you might even have some rook to d1 ideas, g4, maybe knight to e5 in the future. All depend what the LA plays, really. Rook 8 to c8, and now rook f to e1, and now bishop back to g6. The bishop no longer really useful here. The queen is not on this diagonal, the rook is not on this diagonal, so bishop to g6, and now queen to b3. We have queen to b8. The queen is still nicely guarding the b7 pawn, but you free up the c file for the rook. So now both the rook on the c and on the d file are looking very nice. And here pawn to c5. Now this is a very committal move, and while you do give up the d5 square for the black knight, you also free up the c4 square for your own knight. So you can play knight to c4, then knight to b6, knight to d6, knight to e5. All of this becomes possible. So of course knight to d5. Lei doesn't wait. She just puts the knight on d5. Very beautiful central square, where it controls all of these squares in your opponent's half of the board. It doesn't get really any better than that. Knight to c4, and now pawn to a4. This is a beautiful pawn sacrifice, which will give Lei a lot of activity for the sacrificed pawn. So queen captures, and now even pawn to b5, sacrificing another pawn because now, of course, you cannot just move the queen. The knight is hanging as well. So c captures on b6 en passant, knight captures on b6, and now knight captures on b6. We have queen captures on b6, and now the bishop here is hanging, so bishop back to a1. We have queen to a5, offering a queen trade, well, Wenjun accepts. Queen captures, knight captures, and now rook captures on c8, rook captures, and now, okay, white is up a pawn, but if you're not careful, it's not going to mean all that much. So also you have this d4 pawn is a backwards pawn. You can't really advance it, and of course you can't usually, but now you can't, and you have to do it. And pawn to d5 is the absolute best move here. The pawn cannot be captured as the bishop on e7 would hang. So here we have knight to b3, and now just d captures on e6. Knight to b3 stops the rook from capturing on e6 after pawn captures, as the bishop on a1 would be hanging. So d captures, we have f captures on e6, and now just bishop to e5. This gives up the a3 pawn, but the problem is if you try to defend it, yes, you will keep the pawn, but then your position will just be very, very passive. The bishop is now under attack, and well, if rook captures on e6 trying to trade bishops, you will just play bishop c5, go after the f2 pawn, and now white really can't, white doesn't really have anything to show for this extra pawn. So f captures on e6 with bishop to e5, and now just bishop captures on a3. So Tingjie eliminates the passed a pawn. We have rook to e3 now attacking the knight and bishop, and you have to defend it. Bishop to c2. We have knight to d4 offering a trade now, and knight captures on d4. We have rook captures on a3, eliminating the bishop pair, and now knight to c6 attacks the bishop, and here we have bishop captures on c6. One would expect to just bishop back to b2 or bishop back to a1 to keep the bishop pair on the board, but not Wenjun. She decides to pick up the knight. We have rook captures, and now rook to a8 with check. Why does she do this? Well, the bishop pair is very nice. Grabbing a pawn is sometimes nicer. So king f7, rook to a7 with check, and now king to e8, and now rook captures on g7, grabbing a pawn. And now she is up a pawn, but it's okay, you're up a pawn in endgame with bishops of opposite color, which still is not as drawish, as there still are rooks on the board. So you will be able to also create threats against your opponent's king, because here the pawns don't really matter if you can start attacking your opponent's king, because the light square bishop, if the light square bishop and the rook are attacking, the dark square bishop can't really oppose the light square bishop. So in opposite color bishops, when you're attacking, it's really like you're up a piece. This usually goes for when there's a queen on the board still, and maybe a bit more pieces, but positions can be very different, and it can matter in many different positions. So here we have king to f8, and now pawn to g4. You have to start advancing somehow, so this is how Wenjun does it. Rook to c5 attacks the bishop, and bishop to f6. We have bishop to e4, and now king to h2. We have rook to b5, waiting to see what Wenjun does, and now rook to e7. Goes after the pawn. If you could put your bishop on f5 to control these two pawns, that'd be great, but you can't, so you have to do it some other way. Rook to b6, and now pawn to h4, continuing the march forward. And now we have rook to b3. And what's the reason behind this rook to b3 move and just giving up the e6 pawn? Well, the reason is you don't really have a move here. If you just try wasting moves with king to g8, let's see what happens. Pawn h5, king to f8, now king to g3. If you again repeat moves, pawn to f3, and once the bishop moves, doesn't really matter where, pawn to g5 comes. Okay, you're gonna start continue wasting moves. Pawn to g6 comes, and now this is a problem. H captures and h6, and that's it. This will come with check, and the queen comes into the game. Everything is defended, so you have to play g5 in order for the bishop to defend this. I mean, it's an attempt, but not really a good one. h7 with check, bishop captures, and now, of course, rook to g7 check, where you either move the king away and then you lose the bishop, or you play king to h8 and then rook captures and g5 is checkmate. So that answers the question, can we just do nothing and move our king back and forth, and is this a draw just because there are bishops of opposite color here? No, it's not. So okay, rook to b3, Tingjie forced to look for active solutions, and now, of course, rook captures on e6, grabbing a pawn. Bishop to f3 challenges the g4 pawn, g5, and bishop to g4. Rook to e7, again going after the h7 pawn, bishop to f5 with king to g2, and now bishop to h3 with check, king back to g1, and bishop to f5 with pawn to h5, continuing to push forward, rook to h3, now going after the pawn, and now pawn to h6. So now the question is, how do you break through, as everything is on dark squares, and this bishop nicely controls the h7 pawn and the g6 square? Is it even possible to win this? Well, yes, but black also has to help a little bit. We have rook to d3, again waiting to see what happens here. How are you to break the light square barrier? King h2. And okay, rook to h3 with check, king g2. We have rook back to d3, and now pawn to f3. Rook back to d7, offering a rook trade, and now rook to e5. Of course, you cannot trade rooks. The opposite color bishop endgame is a draw. So rook e5, and now we have bishop to c2. Getting the bishop out of harm's way. Pawn to f4, and now rook to d5. This is a very nice move, and it was played with some 2.5 minutes on the clock for late Tingjie. Problem is, if you capture, then bishop e4 check, picks up the rook, and then it's, of course, a draw. But Wenjun had some 15 minutes on the clock here. She just moves the rook, rook to e7, and now bishop back to f5. We have king to f2. Now comes rook to d2 with check. King to e3, attacks the rook, and now rook back to d6. Here it would be better to push the white king back with rook to d3 check, king to e2, and just keep the sorry, not rook to d4, just keep the tension, because why is this so good? Well, what do you do here? If you play something like bishop captures on d4, then king captures on e7, and it's very strong. You're putting pressure on the f4 pawn. If king to f3, you can always just repeat, or king to e3 or king to f3, you can always just repeat a check, and the king has to go back. But rook to d6 was played right away, and now comes rook to c7. We have rook to d3 with check, king to e2, and now rook back to d5. We have bishop to c3. Getting the bishop out, and now king to e8. We have king to f2, king to f8, and now bishop to b4 with check. So switching this diagonal for this one, king to e8, and now rook to e7 with check, forcing the king to come to d8. So king to d8, and now rook to f7. We have king to e8, and now rook to f8 with check, king d7, and now bishop back to c3, returning the bishop to this diagonal now with the king being kicked out of the corner. And here the problem is, let's say you play king to e7. Well, while possible, it requires quite a lot of calculating. But the point is, yes, you can play it, and rook captures on f5 is not a possibility, because after rook captures in g6, you're not winning, because rook captures on f4 comes with check. So you always have to keep this in mind. So bishop to g6 was played, even though, okay, rook captures on f5 wasn't really a threat at the moment. Rook to g8 now, again, very, very dangerous. And now, if you go something like bishop to f5, it still doesn't work. Even though you don't have rook captures on g6, you can play g6. And now if bishop captures, you will just capture it. And the black rook is too far away. H captures h7, rook to h5. You just promote. The bishop, of course, covers that square. Rook captures, bishop captures, and that's it. White, of course, completely winning here. So instead, after rook to g8, rook to d6 was played, and now bishop to e5 attacks the rook. And here, you have to keep the rook on this 6th rank. You have to prevent rook captures on g6. You have to play rook to c6 or rook to b6 or rook to a6. But a very few seconds on the clock, late Tingjie played rook to d2 check with 20 seconds on the clock. But now it doesn't work. But it's not like you can play anything. There's only one move for white here that wins the game. So feel free to pause the video and try to find this, elusive square while I give you a couple of seconds. So, for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on not playing something weird like king to g3. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is king to f3. This is the only move that wins, and it wins because it prevents bishop to e4, which is a key move for black to defend this position. And king to g3 does seem like maybe a move that you would want to play, but like I said, after bishop to e4, it just doesn't work, because after g6, now okay, everything loses if you capture. There's rook to g2 with check. That's the problem. And after the king moves, you will just pick up the pawn with the rook, and now it's just a draw. However, after king to f3, it's a bit different. Now it doesn't work. Now if you try something like bishop to e4 is impossible, but even if bishop to f5, you can still push it to g6, and after bishop captures, you will just sacrifice h7, rook to h2, and it's the exact same thing. h8 queen, rook captures, bishop captures, and you are winning this, of course, very easily. So after king to f3, rook to d3 check was played with some 7 seconds on the clock, and now king to g4. We have rook to d1. If bishop to e4, again, doesn't really matter, just g6 works in pretty much every line. So rook to d1 was played, but now, of course, you all know what Wenjun played. She played rook captures on g6, and there is no going back. H captures h7, and I believe it was in this position on move 72 that Tingjie resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. So she won game 5, but now she loses game 8, and Wenjun equalizes the match. So we have 4 more games in the match, with the match for the moment being a tie. Yeah, here you resign for the exact same reason. Rook h1, you would just promote. Rook has to be given for the queen. Bishop captures, and of course the position is completely winning. There's nothing even to try here. So yeah, very nicely done by Wenjun. It was a well played endgame. At that one moment, she gave up her bishop pair to win a pawn, which not everyone would do. People prefer the bishop pair to being up a pawn, but she went for it. She said, all right, maybe if Tingjie will be able to trade down rooks and force an opposite color bishop endgame, then it's a draw. But if not, my chances are good, and well, it worked out. So very nicely done by her, and we'll see what happens in the other 4 games. So yeah, that's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and that little bit of info about Chongqing in the beginning of the video. I would like to thank David Kimura, Rod Hill, Phil Malthus, Johan Bridger, and Richard Phillips for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of this wonderful event until it finishes. So thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.